So I just released 100 new sounds for the Korg Minilogue, and in this video I want to talk a little bit about the process behind making the sounds. I want to show you some demos of the sounds, but I also want to give some tips and tricks on sound design. So if that sounds interesting, stick around. So I've had the Korg Minilogue for about a year now, and I thought it was time to release a sound pack. So this pack is called Shadow and Light, and it contains 100, or actually 101 sounds for the Minilogue. And all the sounds you're hearing in this video are 100% Minilogue sounds, no effects added, no bells and whistles. So it's just the Minilogue and the sounds I've programmed for it. And in the pack you get the 101 individual program files as well as a big library file, so you can use either to load, and you need the Korg librarian to load it, but it's not very difficult. It can take a little time to get used to the librarian, but once you do, it's a very practical tool to get patches into the Minilogue and back. But there can be no great sound design without a little sip of the coffee. And I know I shouldn't be slurping on camera, but you could sample it and make some original sounds from it. Tip number 1. So where did the inspiration for these patches come from? Well, it didn't really have any, conscious inspiration, but when I look back at the sounds, I do think I'm heavily influenced by Jean-Michel Jarre, his kind of melodic, a little bit of vibrant style of sounds. But at the same time, I'm not sure if they really sound like Jarre or Jarre, as we say in Sweden. But I do feel connected to the very epic sound that he got, and I also enjoy the kind of evolving sound that he uses. And the name Shadow and Light refers to the pack having two sides. So there's the melodic, very, I think for a Minilogue anyway, warm kind of sounds, but there's also these kind of harsh bass sounds that I try to shape. So it's kind of the two sides of the pack, really. What have I learned making these patches, and what kind of tips can I give you? Well, just looking at the Minilogue, you have the two different pitches for the two oscillators, and I just use slight detuning on both oscillators, and I also use the cross mod depth, just a smidge on pretty much all the sounds, to create a little bit of a detuned feel. But then there's also a very interesting function that I think many people overlook. There's the pitch envelope generator button or knob that you can use, and when you use that, it creates a kind of pitch sliding effect for oscillator number 2, and using that in clever ways is also very interesting. So that's a knob you should really check out. Here's a general tip. Of course, if you use a lot of pitch modulation, there's the risk that the sound doesn't fit with your other sounds. But what you can do is you can try and make the change very quick or very short. Like it's a very short pitch shift, for example. That's a bit like when you apply LFO to pitch modulation, and you get the kind of mod wheel effect. But you can also do it with an envelope generator applied to pitch, so that, for example, when you play a chord, just at the start of the chord, it's slightly detuned. wow, wow, and that's just one of the oscillators. So it creates, so this the first oscillator is still playing, you know, a C or a D or something, and the second oscillator gives it a little wah movement, pitch movement. But just when you press it, because of the envelope generator, depending on how you had it set up. And you can do this pretty much on any synthesizer, and I found that was really interesting. So it might not be a new tip, but it's something that I found was a lot of fun to work with, really. So besides using detuning and applying envelope generation to the pitch, you should also look into making the sounds less sharp. So here I have two tips. The first tip is be very mindful of the cutoff, as also using different settings for the filter. On the Minilogue there are 2 filter settings, and on other synthesizers there can be more. On the Moog Sub 37 I think there are 4 settings for the filter, so of course you can do a lot more with it, and this will impact how harsh the sound is, how it sounds really when you open up the filter. So be mindful and listen to how harsh does it sound, because a lot of the perception of warmth has from, at least for me, to do with the filter and how hard it sounds, how soft it sounds. So what you can do is you dial it back a bit, and on the Minilogue in particular, you just increase the resonance a bit. When you increase the resonance a bit on the Minilogue, you'll drop some of the bass, of course, but for a lead sound, it does create a more subtle sound, I'd say. Now the second piece of advice is to warm up the sound by applying reverb. But wait, I hear you say, the Minilogue doesn't have a reverb, it has a delay but no reverb. Well, you can sort of work around this by using a sort of shorter decay, a shorter sustain, but a longer release. And when you have the longer release, you'll still have a contained sound, but with a tail. So the tail will give it kind of a reverby shimmer, turn down the cutoff a bit, increase the resonance a bit, and you sort of start to contain the sound, even though it has a long release. Then you apply the magic of the high-pass filter delay in the, let's see what it's called, it's post filter, the post filter configuration. So it's after the filter on the Minilogue. So what it basically does is that it cuts a lot of bass. Now of course this is not ideal for a bass sound, but you don't really want a lot of reverb and tail on a bass sound anyway. So what you do here is you set the high pass to about, say, 11 o'clock, and then you set the delay to about somewhere around, say, 1 o'clock on the dial, and then you have the feedback somewhere around 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, or maybe 2 o'clock, depending on how much feedback you actually want. And this gives you a more, it does add delay, of course, but it also, with the feedback turned back a bit, it does add a bit of a reverberation to the sound. So this is of course something you should play around with, and it does depend on what kind of sounds you want to make. So in summary, don't be afraid to detune a sound, but be sure that you still keep like the key of the sound intact, so it doesn't become too detuned, so it's not unusable. I do have 1 or 2 sounds in my pack that are, you know, by design meant to sound broken, because that can be very interesting as an effect or as an intro or something, but most sounds are not that heavily detuned that they are unusable, at least I hope. And with Minilogue in particular, but also other synths, work on the warmth. And I think here the filter settings, the different kind of dB slopes of the filter, how harsh the sound can sound is very important to work with. And also, secondly on this part is using the strengths of a particular synthesizer in creative ways to create warmth. So in the Minilogue, I think a long release for lead sounds, but shorter decay and sustain is very good. And also playing around with the delay to create kind of a warmer, broader, more fat sound is really interesting as well. And I think many people overlook it. I was one of those people who didn't like the delay on the Minilogue, but now that I worked with it for a year, I can see that you can make some really interesting sounds using it. So as of this year, I made a couple of different sound packs for the Minilogue, the circuit, sample packs, and so on. And I do want to give you sort of an advice or a philosophy that I think could be interesting. I think that when we approach sound design, especially as beginner, because I count myself truly as a beginner, even though I do put in a lot of hours into it, but I'm still really a novice. And while I'm saying that, it does sound wrong in my head, a novice. Because you see, the reason why I say I'm a novice is because I have this technical notion of sound design. That sound design somehow has to do with knowing all the technical specification and all the interactions of a synthesizer or different functions on a synthesizer. And I still feel like I can't really explain all these interactions perfectly, and I still know it perfectly, in reduced down to exactly what they do. But at the same time, I do think I make some interesting sounds. So how does this fit together? Well, I have an analogy, I think. Analogy? Yeah, the analogy is this. Making sounds, of course, require technical knowledge, but it's a bit like sculpting. Sculpting is something you do with your hands. And when you're working with something like the Minilogue, it becomes sort of like a sculpting process. I realized this the other day when I was listening to an audio book. And I was listening to this audio book and I was sculpting sounds at the same time. It didn't really work out intellectually for me. Like, I'm listening to something, but I'm listening to the sound, and how can I process the two things at the same time? Well, the reason is because when I was sculpting the sounds, I was doing it with the knobs, with my hands. I wasn't doing it, thinking about, now I should apply this because it has this interaction. No, it just went fluidly. I just listened and I tried and I went back and then trial and error, of course. And of course, a lot of technical knowledge goes into this because I know the basic function and how things interact on a basic level. But the point is, I didn't think about it like that. I just went with it. Much more, it was very subtle. It was much more like sculpting something. Of course you need to know your tools and you need to know something about the material, but then you have to let go and just go with it and try to feel your way. Because it's so easy to get stuck in theoretical or intellectual understanding of sound, just as with any creative process, that you get stuck inside your own head thinking about it. Just like mastering, for example, you start to think about, now I should add this, now I should do this, blah, blah, blah. Instead of listening, what does the song actually need? What do I feel like adding or taking away? So I'm not saying that technical knowledge is somehow unimportant. No, it's not. It's very important. But we have this narrative online that somehow, if you're a good, synth guy, synth guru, if you're a good synthesizer person, you should know all functions and know how they interact and know the kind of technical specification, know the technical differences between different kind of slopes or LFOs or something like that. Because otherwise you're not credible, otherwise you're not knowledgeable. And I think that's beside the point. I think a rudimentary understanding is important, but more so you need to have an ear. Just like with everything with music, you need to have a good ear for what sounds good. That way, you're not just replicating other people's sounds, but you're perhaps sculpting something slightly original, slightly personal at least. If not original, slightly personal. I'm all about that because I think the majority of us are not here to become professional musicians or producers and topping the charts or living off our music. We're just here to express ourselves musically. So that's why I think it's so important to do just that. So if you want to get this sound pack, just check the description of this video. There are links and information on how to get them. There are a couple of different ways. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it, hit the like button, consider subscribing to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you so much.